After such a gracious, generous introduction, I can only disappoint people here. I'd like to start by thanking Seth, I did that actually, and thanking the organizers for what I consider to be a first-rate conference. I'm impressed on many, many levels. I don't think that such a conference could have taken place 40 years ago, even 30 years ago. This is for you, Mitch, you've done the almost unbelievable. First of all, it's quite evident that Messianic Judaism and Jewish believers in Jesus have today a very large intellectual, creative, scholarly elite that is impressive by any measure. It is also amazing and impressive how inclusive, collegial, and pleasant the atmosphere is. Very rarely had I been in such academic exchanges in which people are listening to each other with tolerance, with interest, with appreciation. I've learned a great deal, and I can tell you also that it's very rare to find such I would say, a gathering of such creative, special persons, human beings, and characters. I'd like also to thank not just the organizers and the leaders, but to thank everybody here for being here at 7:30 in the evening. If the same talk had been given in a university setting, there would be 5 people, 3 of which were paid to be there. Let me... I'm calling that the appropriation of the rejected Messiah. Before I started, when I spoke with people about what I'm going to speak, quite a few people were surprised. Jesus in Israeli culture, Jesus in Israeli art, literature, poetry, historiography, and my claim would be that since particularly the 1920s, big time, Jesus appears extensively in Israeli culture, in Israeli thought, in Israeli writing, in Israeli art. And my questions, therefore, are why, who, whom, in what manners, what are the, let's call it the collective national agendas that stand behind it? And what are the individualistic agendas of writers, artists, and historians when they present Jesus, and how do they present Jesus? Because again, my claim would be this is not Jesus of Toldot Yeshu. This is a very different Jesus. This is a Jewish Jesus, an Israeli Jesus. This is Jesus as one of us. This is us as Jesus, Jesus as us. And I would like to, with you, analyze and explain and reflect on such a development which is not self-understood. Why would what was mostly a secular, Zionist, national revival, a lot of it socialist, bring Jesus into the picture, take interest in Jesus, reclaim Jesus, utilize Jesus for its purposes, and in what ways? Jesus appears for the first time with what is known as the third immigration, the third Zionist immigration that started in 1918, the third wave of Zionist immigration following World War I. Thousands, tens of thousands of immigrants came for various purposes, but the face of the immigration was Zionist for the first time, a little bit what was already the second wave of immigration, Aliyah Shniya. Aliyah Shlishit is socialist. The Histadrut starts in 1920-21. Great leaders such as Ben-Gurion, they were in Palestine before, but now they are leaders and become public persona. And here we have artists, historians, writers bringing up Jesus. This wasn't done by Ben-Gurion. This was done by those were people who knew the leaders of the small yeshuv, the small Jewish community of the time, which was merely just a few tens of thousands of people, and they were in conversation with each other. Here we have an artist who, in spite of being what you could call a member of the bohemian circles, settled in Tel Aviv. Reuven Rubin comes from Romania, studied in France. He is also a member of the mainstream. Just to give you an idea, in 1948, when the State of Israel was born, he was dispatched immediately as the first Israeli ambassador to Romania, among other reasons because he was a personal friend of from childhood of the communist Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time. An educated, intellectually oriented person who much of his work was grounded in and focused on the Palestinian-Israeli Holy Land landscape. We'll see that as a huge theme of bringing Jesus back to the landscape and even identifying him with the landscape. Here we have something that is quite striking. You can see that. Reuven Rubin, the encounter. Here is Jesus coming down from the cross, and a Jew who represents, if you will, who is painted as a traditional Jew, perhaps a Second Temple Jew, but very much likely the traditional Jew of the modern era, seems the persecuted Jew, the suffering Jew. And Jesus is sitting not exactly with him, holding his hand, but watching, perhaps identifying, perhaps considering. Jesus comes down from the cross for his people, if you will. We'll see that theme a few times. This is perhaps the same Jesus, but here we will see again the reflective, intellectual Rubin. Most people did not think about him as such because they concentrated on mostly on his nature-focused themes. But this is about the Orthodox Romanian priest, Gala Galaxion. This was what we would call a philo-Semitic priest. This is post-World War I Romania that has accumulated quite a lot of lands from what used to be the Habsburg Empire and previously from Hungary, such as Transylvania. And there's a question, what is Romanian nationalism? Who is Romanian, who is not Romanian? Many people rejected the Jews, particularly those Jews who were in the new provinces of Romania. Galaxion is this priest who called a Orthodox Romanian priest who called on Romanian nationalists, on Romanian people to accept the Jews, to be kind to the Jews, to relate to the Jews as their brothers and sisters. And here we see again, Jesus in this case, again, Jesus coming down from the cross, in some ways represents the Jewish people. Jesus is not just Jewish, or Jesus the Jew, it is Jesus as representing the Jewish people. And Galaxion is holding his hand, comforting him, behaving like his brother. This will pay another attention to the fact most Israeli Hebrew, this is about Israel didn't exist before 48, but this is already called after the British took over Palestine in 1917. This is not anymore, this is Palestine, Aleph Yud, Eretz Israel. It's not Israel, but it's Eretz Israel. Israeli Jews call themselves Eretz Israelim. This is about everything I'm dealing with is Hebrew culture, the new, mostly secular culture that starts before 1918, but really becomes predominant and takes over during the mandate, British mandate period, and in the 1920s. And the people who are there are mostly immigrants. They come from elsewhere. They come from Eastern Europe mostly, though we'll see also Central European. And those people are more connected to Orthodox Christianity in different varieties or to Catholic Christianity, also in different varieties. We won't see yet the influence of Protestant encounter with Israeli, or if you want to call it, they were Palestinian Jews until 1948. Here we see another, just as Rubin is offering his pictures, he's a painter. We see here Joseph Klausner. Rubin is one of the major painters of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in Palestine and then Israel. A canonical painter. Here we have a canonical but rather controversial figure, a major figure, a founder of the Hebrew University, the founder of the Department of Hebrew Literature at the Hebrew University, Joseph Klausner, started already as a leader of Hebrew, revived Hebrew literature and poetry already in Odessa. He was actually a Lithuanian Jew, but he reached, and he studied in Germany, but he reached Odessa before he reached Palestine. He came, it was celebrated 100, he came in 1919 on Ruslan, a magic, mythical ship that brought to Palestine hundreds and hundreds of immigrants, the first wave of the third Aliyah from, in that case, from Odessa. Among them, Yitzhak Rabin's mother, many, many people. This was celebrated in Israel all over now. And Klausner comes. Klausner is already a famous editor, a famous writer. In Odessa, Odessa was a center of Hebrew literature. Bialik, Chaim Nachman Bialik, the poet, was there. Perhaps people heard about him. Achad Ha'am, a thinker, a writer, an essayist. And Klausner both writes poetry and literature, but he also considers himself to be an historian. An historian, as you could see, of Second Temple Judaism, and an historian, certainly, of Hebrew literature. Here we have his canonical book, Jesus of Nazareth. Let me just, and then you can say, why am I going to be talking about the translator? Herbert Danby. Herbert Danby, the fact that he translated the book into English, published in 1925, tells us a great deal also about the book and the project. It's actually a Jewish-Christian project of reconciliation and mutual recognition. Herbert Danby is not an ordinary translator. He came to Palestine, Eretz Israel, immediately after, or quite immediately, after the British conquest, brought over to work as a liaison to the Jews in the Anglican Church in St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. I'm sure people were there, some of the people here. He worked as an aide, as a lieutenant of the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem at the time. Most of the Anglican, with the exception, of course, of Christ Church and various outreach programs to the Jews, many of the Anglicans there were not exactly friends of the Jewish community or really into Christian-Jewish reconciliation and mutual recognition. Danby should be recognized as one of the earliest proponents of what would turn into an interfaith movement, a movement of reconciliation and of Christian recognition of the legitimacy of Jewish existence outside and alongside the church. I'm brought here the fact that to this day, Danby is the translator of the Mishnah into English. This is still in print. This is still in use. This is recognized by Jews as the valid perhaps translation of the Mishnah into English. Some of you, I'm sure, know the book. I have no doubt about it. I don't know if all of you know Jesus of Nazareth. It's an amazing book on some levels. It's not, I've heard it quite a number of presentations. Most of you would not learn or study the historical Jesus from Joseph Klausner. Let me be open about that. His work was really a work with a mission of Judaism in Palestine now, in Eretz Israel, Hebrew revival, Zionist mission, reconciliation with Christianity, opening itself to a new relationship with, quote-unquote, the Gentiles, with, quote-unquote, the Christian world. In this case, it is a Protestant-Jewish cooperation, because Danby was an Anglican priest. Danby, recognized as a first-rate scholar after spending 19 years in Jerusalem, he would then be invited to Oxford to become a Regius Professor of Hebrew. Even today, getting a professorship at Oxford University is not something that happens every day to everyone. But in 1937, it was really like being appointed to a god on the Olympus. So he received recognition for his work. Now, let me then introduce Jesus of Nazareth. I will later on introduce other works of other people. Wishing to appropriate Jesus, wishing to respect Jesus, wishing to respect Christianity and its great symbol. Klausner follows the narrative of the New Testament in what for many people here would be considered perhaps not critically enough, not philological enough, not fully historical. This is also a work from 1922, and he was aware of the work of Jews, 19th century mostly German Jews, but also English Jews, who wrote about Jesus, trying to accept him and recognize him as a Jewish teacher and figure of his time. You might be surprised at what he had to say about Jesus. So let's read that together, because his big motto was Judaism and universalism, Yahadut ve'enoshut. On his home, which doesn't exist anymore because his heirs sold it, it became, some people here know of Talpiot, Rehov Klausner, Klausner Street, named after he died. He had a home, the same street, incidentally, where Shai Agnon, the great writer, was there. I was tempted to bring Agnon on Christianity, but it's not Agnon on Jesus. And exactly Agnon on Jesus. And those two didn't get along, but as good two Jerusalemite writers and thinkers. But he had on his house, Yahadut ve'enoshut, also in his office at the university, Yahadut ve'enoshut. In this case, so his engagement with Jesus, his very positive engagement with Jesus, was his project of Yahadut and Enoshut. Jews should accept Jesus, should embrace Jesus, should respect Jesus, should recognize Jesus not as God, but as this great national figure. At the same time that he is this great, is committed to universalism, he's also becoming, it didn't start that way, more and more a nationalist Jew. He would join the Jabotinsky camp in the 1930s. By 1948, he would become the candidate of what today is the Likud, it was then Cherut party, for president. He was not exactly a member of the group, but he was a Jabotinsky associate, follower, a right-winger, if you will, despising the more socialist Labor Party and the Labor Union. And what he has to say about Jesus is just amazing. Jesus Yet nothing, let's say, in all of this, Jesus is the most Jewish of Jews, more Jewish than Shimon ben Shattach, more Jewish even than Hillel. Yet nothing is more dangerous to national Judaism than this exaggerated Judaism. It is the ruin of national culture, the national state, the national life. There is no call for the enactment of laws for justice, for national statecraft, where belief in God and the practice of an extreme and one-sided ethic is in itself enough. There we have the negation of national life and of the national state. So we have here Judaism, universalism, but then the most important thing for us is what I would call unmitigated building of a nation at this time. This is the 1920s. Some of you might have read the book Judas, written by Amos Oz, published 2014. We'll come to it, translated 2016. Amos Oz is the most famous Israeli novelist of the last half century. In the book on Judah, he writes that Hebrew writers and historians were afraid to touch Judah. The Jews in general were afraid to touch Judah. This is not exactly true, we'll see. In fact, it's not true. So I'm allowed to argue with Amos Oz. Do you allow me to? The first novel on Jesus was actually published in 1924 by a writer named Natan Bistritsky Agmon. He was a socialist, a Zionist who came in the Third Aliyah, and was the founder of the group Bitania Elite that was the basis for the establishment of HaShomer HaTzair, a socialist, almost communist, later on pro-Soviet Zionist group. He later on left and moved to the mainstream of the Labor Party, Mapai. I'm not bringing up his book because I don't think it's, I have to be careful what I say, I don't think it was as influential and compelling as the book I'm presenting here. The book I'm presenting here came out in 1937, Bamish'ol Hatzar, in the Narrow Path. The picture you see here is from the 1950 edition, which I have. Kabak, Aaron Avram Kabak, A.A. Kabak, an educated Eastern European Jew, studied at the University of Bern in Switzerland, comes to Palestine in the early 20s, becomes a school teacher in the school in which I studied in Jerusalem after he already died. But I had a teacher who studied with him, also a writer. So this is Kabak, and Kabak wrote a number of novels, a respected writer of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, a canonical writer for the young, nascent Hebrew reading population. Why is he writing on Jesus? And of course, how is he writing about Jesus? Kabak was very sick in 1935, and he took a vow. If I recover, I become a religious, observant person. He had some kind of religious experience during his medical crisis. You would expect him, of course, to write a very different novel, but he chose to write about Jesus. He chose to write about Jesus. We'll soon see how he wrote about him. He is the first, unlike Bistritsky Agmon, unlike Joseph Klausner, Jesus for him is first and foremost a religious figure, a religious teacher, if you will, something that today we could call a guru. He writes about Jesus with huge respect, huge affection, huge appreciation, with one setback, which I'm not sure he was even aware of what it means. He might have. This is the fact that he mentions there incidentally the rumors about Jesus' birth, which follows an unfavorable interpretation. You know, that his mother was raped by a Roman legionnaire. I don't think he but it's there, and from our point, our sensitivities, it's there, and we have to acknowledge it. Otherwise, there's also a huge attachment to the land of Israel, to the scene. Jesus walks, Jesus sees, Jesus enjoys the view, Jesus enjoys the fruit, but it's also Jesus, the people's person, the healer. Yes, he performs miracles, but he's the healer of souls. That's how people gather to him. It's very often the down and out, people who have issues, people who are struggling, people who have questions. They come to Jesus, and Jesus offers love and guidance and support and wisdom. And no other is more troubled and more in need of Jesus and receives more help from Jesus than Judah. And, okay. So you didn't hear me all that time? Okay, perhaps that's good. So we have here, let me just read it to you. Perhaps. אתה יהודה, כל העולם כולו לא נברא אלא בשבילך. You, Judah, the entire earth was created only for you. It reminds us a little bit, if you read your Kipling, except here it's not conditional. It's the idea of there's room for everyone, there's love for everyone, there's God for everyone. Contrary to Amos's claim, Kabak spends time on Mary and on Jacob. Kabak spends time on Martha, a lot of Martha, a lot on Mary Magdalene. But he spends a lot of time on the troubled soul of Judah. And in a way that's both compassionate, but mostly does justice to Jesus and not to Judah. The claim that, so perhaps this is one of the first time in which certainly Hebrew writers, Hebrew modern writers, are confronting Judah and the story of Judah. We'll come to Amos Oz, who spend a whole novel on that. Speaking of the landscape, those people are coming from Russia, from Romania, from, in this case, from Vienna, and they're encountering and those are writers, poets, we'll come to poets. Those are painters, those are sculptors, and they are working with the land. And they're fascinated by the land, and they love the land, and they love the sun, and they love the hills. Here we have a painter, drawer of the Jerusalem hills, that's what he was known for, and of the flora of the Jerusalem hills. Leopold Krakauer came from Vienna in the 1920s, was also a canonical painter, very popular among the Palestinian Jewish elite. And this is Jesus on the cross. But it's not Jesus on a traditional cross. This is also a way of appropriation through the land, appropriation through nature. Krakauer lived just above Emek HaMatzleva, for those of you who know Jerusalem, the Valley of the Cross. He lived when the Valley of the Cross was all olive trees, before the road was built, before so many things were built. It was not all olive trees. There was also the monastery, and I see a good Jerusalemite there kind of smiling, forgivingly, I hope. But there were many more olive trees than now, including in his neighborhood Rechavia. But his home was really above the valley. And so here he's appropriating Jesus, if you will, and appropriating the cross as not the cross that was made out of a tree from the valley of the cross, but as the tree itself. We're moving now to a very different situation. All the people I spoke about worked before World War II, or just at the beginning of World War II, before the horrors of the Holocaust became real and before they were known. Here we have one of the most, I would say, powerful poets and his most powerful book. Uri Tzvi Greenberg, again, he started as a socialist, came in the early 1920s to Palestine, a socialist originally, moving into the radical right wing. He was a founder and leader in 1929, following the riots of 1929. He became a founder and leader of something that people didn't hear about, Brit HaBiryonim, named, I see some people heard about it, named after the most zealous rebels of the war against the Romans, 67, 70, 67, whatever you want to call it, 67, 70. 67, 70. An anathema to the Labor Party, which was hegemonic at the time. Those people were blamed just a few years later for 1934 for murdering Chaim Arlozorov, who was the head of the foreign office, if you will, of the Jewish Agency, and signed an agreement with Nazi Germany for the transfer of German goods into the country, because otherwise they would not allow German Jews to take out property and money. And this allowed thousands of German Jews to take the property out of the country. And this is very bitter, painful poetry. And Uri Tzvi Greenberg blames Christians and blames Christianity, Christian law, Christian leadership for the massacres, claiming this is a continuation of an entire attitude and of previous harassment and killing. He absolves Jesus. The followers of Jesus are one thing. Jesus is another. Let's read that and see what he says, and a few more people would say. Let me read it first in Hebrew to do justice to the poem. למה כה ששו לרצח הזה הגויים, ולא בושו לבוא ולהביט בפני זה על הצלב? Why they were so eager, so happy to commit this murder, the non-Jews, and were not ashamed to look at the men on the cross. So Jesus, there are the followers of Jesus, and he's saying, who like me, let me already translate straight, who like me was a son of the Hebrews and was crucified because of that by a Roman antagonist, by a Roman hater. How come they were not afraid while playing the organ to smell his blood and our blood, which they have poured? There is here certainly anger, bitterness, accusations, also mourning. This is written, if you read the whole poetry, there's so much pain and agony there. But Jesus was not a murderer. Jesus was us. Jesus was me, something that we will see now among writers and artists a number of times. Jesus was me, I am Jesus, we are one of a kind. And it goes on and on. Here it's about the blood that pours on the altar. And again, there is this terrible, terrible accusation. And there was a celebration for the children of Gog and Magog. He's turning that into Christians who now were enjoying the fat of their homes. And young ladies were rejoicing with young men while carrying the Galilean god, which they produced from marble or produced from wood. Not easy poetry to read. Incidentally, I won't go into details, but of course the Labour Party, who owned a lot of the publishing houses at the time, wouldn't publish his poetry, and it was published by a bourgeois publishing house. Jesus as me as Jesus, the identification of the individual artist with Jesus is very evident with Moshe Castell. What you see here is Jesus, right? You would expect that what's written there is Jesus, King of the Jews. Not quite. What you see there is Castell. This is 1948. Castell first lost his wife to cancer, and then this is 1940s, pre-antibiotics. He lost his 3-year-old son. He's responding to private tragedies. He's actually responding even to a mental breakdown. But something that you would not find, this is for a specific, this is for Adolfo. What you won't find in publication of the Israel Museum is enormous bitterness of the Sephardic, Old Jerusalemite Castell against the artistic establishment, the museum establishment, and later on the Israel Museum. He saw himself as the marginalized, overlooked, misunderstood, suffering Jesus. We'll see that a few times when Israelis, and this is not something that you would have seen in the Jewish small towns of Russia or Romania or Poland or Lithuania or the Ukraine, you'll see Israeli Jews appropriating Jesus as the ultimate icon of suffering, which they can identify with. Suffering on account of marginality, suffering on account of preaching the truth, but rubbing the establishment and the mainstream the wrong way. Now you'll see an Israeli Beat Generation Jesus. You thought that's impossible? Yes, it is. This is Pinchas Sadeh, whose book in 1959 was a sensation. If you would read today what the critics wrote about him in newspapers, in magazines at the time, you would be amazed. This is a book that should never have been published. This is a book that should never have seen the day. How dare he? It's a pornographic book. There's no pornography there. But this was really the equivalent of the Beat Generation in Israel. Pinchas Sadeh, already born in Poland, but grew up in Tel Aviv, came as a baby, fought in the war of 1948, was a commander in the Israeli army, was a kibbutz member. He's writing the book after he left the kibbutz. He left the military and refused to serve anymore. He said, I served enough. That's what he writes in his book, his autobiography, Life as a Parable, Achaim Kemashal. And scandal of scandals. He describes there his intimate relationship, his affair with 2 ladies in Jerusalem when he was an art student there. And people were scandalized. You didn't write such autobiographies. There were autobiographies of Zionist leaders that you read, but people don't even mention their wives. Mentioning your lovers, mentioning your love life, mentioning the fact that you had love life even before you married and divorced and married and divorced, we're talking about the Tel Aviv bohemian environment that started in the 20s but now comes into the open, but was discreet, more discreet, and now comes into the open as an Israeli post-1948 generation that is rebelling against the collective Zionist, national, socialist agenda and ideology that is so demanding and so enforcing, and asks you to sacrifice yourself and to make sacrifices all the time for the sake of building the nation. Israel of the 50s, as I like to remind people, at least until 56, 57, had rations. Here is Pinchas Sadeh celebrating individualism, celebrating freedom, celebrating the right of individuals to experiment, to live their lives both intellectually, ideologically, and intimately as they see fit, with no restriction of the righteous labor or religious establishment of the time. Sadeh, he later on published 42 etches that he prepared and paintings for the book. They were not published with the book, so he published it separately years later. He mentions Jesus in his book. He mentions Jesus as his book big time. What is Jesus doing in a bohemian, beat-like, beat-generation-like, rebellious book that celebrates individualism, freedom? While being a kibbutz member, while being a shepherd in the Galilee, he was reading the New Testament and was taken by it, or rather, he was taken by a number of characters in the New Testament, but he celebrates Jesus not as God, but Jesus as the eternal, perfect, fantastic human being that he was. He celebrates Jesus' miracles and accepts them. The etching he prepared, the drawing, was for chapter 12, where he's mentioning his enchantment with Jesus. This was also a horrible scandal at the time, 59, because he's not speaking, unlike people like Klausner or people like Kabak, he's not speaking indirectly about Jesus. This is, I love Jesus, I follow Jesus, I'm enchanted by Jesus. What a great thing for me to have picked the New Testament and start reading it. Look at the drawing. There are a number of drawings of Jesus. But see here again, Jesus is on the cross. There are normative Jews, there are traditional Jews, and there are, if you will, free-thinking, love-making Jews as well. How can Jesus be both? Well, that's exactly why Jesus is there. I am choosing, I am picking, I am celebrating, I am including what I judge to be true, what I judge to be right. In his case, it means both sexual freedom, literary freedom, and religious spiritual freedom. But like Kabak in 1937, there's also a big message there. I disagree with Israeli secular culture that is devoid of spirituality. I can embrace Jesus. I can read the New Testament and be enchanted by it, be mesmerized by it, and at the same time keep my freedom. In fact, it's my freedom that allows me to embrace the book and the story and the person. In Kabak's case, this was his way of telling also secular Israeli culture of the 30s, something is missing. We need to incorporate spirituality, we need to incorporate religious teaching, we need to incorporate the supernatural. Pinchas Sadeh was also a poet Actually, before I go to his poetry, I want to introduce another person, in this case a critic. Baruch Kurzweil was one of the most important literary critics in Israel since his arrival from the Czech Republic in 1937, I think. He was the founder of the Department of Literature in the religious Bar Ilan University, but respected as a major critic of Israeli literature and poetry. Now, let's read what he has to say about life as a parable, because I think that's also very interesting for us. A strange autobiography, no proper education, which wasn't true because Sadeh was educated both in Jerusalem and in London. Cynical, narcissistic, sexual, identifies himself with Jesus, but one needs to defend Jesus from him. I mean, how dare he include Jesus in such profanity? So the Central European educated Kurzweil, again, sees himself also as man of the world in spite of being an observant Jew and a member of the Bar Ilan early community. How dare this pervert, who tells us about those two ladies, early ladies in his early life, dare incorporate Jesus into the story? Now to the poetry. Seth will tell me how much time I've left, because I can go on all night, and I'm not sure you're willing to follow me. Oh, okay, so that's bad. That's bad. That's bad. That's very, very bad. So I'll do only one thing, only one more, because there's more and more and more and more. So here this speaks for itself, of course. The 6,000,001. This is Yigal Tomarkin, the modernist, rebellious Yigal Tomarkin, who embraces Jesus quite a number of times. I mean, you'd think that the rebellious, modernist, radical politically won't embrace Jesus, but Jesus is very, very important for him. Here's Yehuda Amichai, but okay, so let's go more and more. This is the Last Supper, and pay attention that Jesus in the middle, as a soldier, is the one who is actually abandoned by his friends, and the only person looking at him, perhaps to tell tale, is Judah. And here we have the Peita. I think I already mentioned that it's not always Protestant-oriented. But here we have something that is amazing. The memorial to Yitzhak Rabin, 2 weeks after his murder, started with Agnus Dei. You probably remembered, some people remember that. Started with Agnus Dei. For the first time in Israeli history, an official memorial service for multitudes in Tel Aviv starts with Agnus Dei. Rabin as Jesus. Rabin as Jesus, killed like Jesus for the sake of peace, for the sake of his truth, for the sake of humanity. This is a means also for that moment, and I have other poems and other things to show. This is a means for the Israeli secular, laborist, left, quote unquote, to tell the Israeli Orthodox, who in their mind killed Rabin, was an Orthodox right-winger who killed Rabin. Basically, it's a means for them to tell them, go to hell, forgive me, because if this event had been coordinated with Orthodox Jews, there wouldn't be any Agnus Dei there. But here, actually, Bach, who's been canonized in Israeli culture, is embraced, and Jesus is embraced as a means of promoting universal values, and rejecting Orthodox parochial extremism. Here, Dalia Ravikovich, she would publish the poem after Rabin's assassination. Wanted to speak about my teacher, David Flusser, who was also the teacher of Shulem, who is also the teacher of Adolfo, is the teacher of all of us. Just will speak for a minute about him and to tell you that this is a Czech, if you will, humanist who followed Thomas Masaryk, the first president of Czechoslovakia, but who considered himself to be a follower of Jesus without embracing Jesus as God or without embracing the supernatural element in his teaching, but saw himself keenly as a follower of Jesus' teachings, which he interpreted as coming from a point of strength and not of weakness. The pacifism, the altruism of Jesus. And he also believed, and this was mentioned today, that one can decipher, working with kind of removing the editorial layers, one can decipher from the particularly synoptic gospels, but also from John to a certain extent, the real teaching of Jesus, and not only that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, which everybody here embraces the Jewish Jesus, but that since, and this was mentioned also, he wrote quite a number of generations before the Mishnah is out, before the Talmud is written, that you can get a fresh feeling for Second Temple Judaism in a generation before its end from the teaching of Jesus. Amos Oz here spends, I want a minute, Amos Oz here spends a whole book, a story within a story. It's not about Judah, there's a whole love story in Jerusalem of the late 50s, etc., etc. But the protagonist wrote an MA thesis at the university about Judah. And Judah, and Amos Oz makes a claim that is not quite accurate. I mentioned as if Judah was never confronted by Israeli writers, artists, etc., and we know it's not true. By now we know. Now you know, I know, we know. But he is making a point to defend Judah, to kind of redeem Judah, to asking people to treat Judah as one of Jesus' loyal disciples and not disloyal disciples. We can argue, of course, about the message. Where does this leave us? This leaves us with Jesus, who is appropriated for national purposes, for national agenda, for spiritual agenda, for agenda of freedom, experimentation, and the right to choose. But he also leaves us, and on this I didn't show enough, with the individual Jesus who is embraced by poets and artists as their own, not only on a collective basis, but on an individual basis. I, the writer, am Judah. We skipped Yehuda Amichai, my favorite Hebrew poet, who wrote, I'm Jesus. And we're going to have the same fate. And Jesus is peace. But for that, if you want an evening on more writers, poets, and artists on Jesus, I'm more than happy to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We do have time now for a Q&A with Professor Arielle. For those of you who are just coming this evening, let me just share a few of the ground rules briefly. We want to make sure that your question relates to what the speaker has said, to the presentation, to the topic at hand. We want to ask that you form a line at the microphone to save time and to streamline the process. And we're going to ask you to keep your question to a question that's succinct and specifically under 1 minute. So, if you have a question for Professor Arielle based on his presentation, I want to invite you to come on up to the microphone now, and we can begin the Q&A.
Would you consider names like Maurice Gottlieb and Marc Chagall as exponents of this movement of appropriating Jesus as a representative of the Jewish people in the Galut?
Yes, this I would, but I concentrated here specifically on Hebrew culture, on Palestinian Jewish or Israeli Jewish culture, because I think that's distinct. Here in the case of the Israeli experience, there is the issue of the land and the landscape, which Jesus is identified with. He worked here. He preached here. He recruited followers here. He walked there, here. This is Israel. I feel at home with you people. And that's a major theme, which of course in Europe or America would not happen, A. B, another thing is the issue of, if Maurizio Gottlieb was not a Zionist, was not into a Zionist agenda of nation building, did not have an axe to grind as to how does Israeli culture develop, as to what is acceptable and not acceptable. Jesus is very often accepted both as on a national agenda, let's open the gates, let's reconcile, let's accept the rejected Messiah, but also the opposite way around, as an axe to grind against the establishment, as identifying with the outsider, as identifying with the one that we did not study about in school, as kind of discovery, part of a more free and inclusive society. You don't have that outside of Israel. So yes, I would make comparisons. Yes, I would look at development outside of Israel. For example, the idea of the artist as Jesus appears big time, not just in Jewish art outside of Israel, but was very typical to the more experimental and avant-garde artists of Europe, of France, for example, of the late 19th century, early 20th century. We, the artists as Jesus. And Israeli artists, some of them follow. Some of them might have known those pieces of art, some of them might not have known those pieces of art, but we need to make comparisons if we have the time for it. But I think that this is sui generis, this is specific to Israel, what we see there. I don't think that you can decide, let's talk about the Jewish Jesus, which already came about in the 19th century. But the scholars of the 19th century, quite specifically, who worked on Jesus, both in Germany, in America, and in England, were not Zionists trying to build a new nation in Palestine.
Thank you for the great presentation. Can you talk more about the artist who did the Last Supper photo?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you for asking the question, because I didn't have time to present him, and I was not allowed to keep you here all night, turning it into a Passover celebration. Although one of the pieces is the Last Supper. It is Adi Ness, born and raised in Kiryat Gat, which is a development town in the northern Negev, the south of Israel. The periphery also comes from a family that came from Iran. So this is the Israeli periphery, and he is reaching the center. And he is also an openly gay artist. So this isn't the case here, but some of his art is, it's not quite homoerotic, but some people interpret it in such a way. Perhaps there's such an element here too. When he did the Pietà, when he did the Last Supper, those are men. A lot of his this is photography. A lot of his work is on soldiers. not only both his army experience, in which he felt total outsider, which kind of brings Jesus in again. So in the Last Supper, there is the lonely soldier. It seems to him, it doesn't have to be, it seems that everybody else has friends and they are laughing and they are having good time and they connect to each other. And here there is someone in the middle who should be the central figure, but is abandoned. And actually the one person that looks at him is not really, it's dubious. Is he his friend or is he his enemy? This is the classical Judah. There can be other interpretation. This is art. You can interpret it in many ways, but Adines is today a canonical, is the #1 photographer, artistic photographer in Israel, and he teaches photography in the #1 art academy in Israel, Bezalel. Adolfo knows all that. So he affirms, and if Adolfo affirms, I feel good.
Often in artistic portrayals, Jesus is seen as frail and a sign of weakness and suffering. And so much of the movement of the Chalutzim is like about Jews as a strong figure. So how do the artists portraying themselves as weak, how does that play in?
So in the case of Reuven Rubin, Jesus comes down the cross. And Rubin, who just arrived from Europe, grew up in Romania, and was very much involved with the issue of Christian-Jewish relations, not as a dialogue member, but this is a large part of his both intellectual and artistic concern. He is presenting Jesus sometimes as the Jewish people, weak, in need of support, in need of sympathy, and at times it's Jesus and the Jews and a comparison between them and the relationship between them. It's the Jewish Jesus and the suffering Jews and the suffering Jesus. So that's there. But if you look at actually Leopold Krakauer, who did Jesus with the olive tree, who's kind of almost a part of the olive tree, this is not a weak Jesus. This is actually a refusal to go along with the classical Jesus and saying Jesus came out of this land. You know, he's moved by the fact that Jesus in some way, because he's near the Valley of the Cross and he's in Jerusalem, in some ways Jesus is his neighbor. Jesus is his, or the sites relating to Jesus are his sites. Thank you for paying attention to that.
Thank you. These artists that you so wonderfully have presented, they seem to be enamored by Yeshua, but they also stop at this point of divinity and collectively seem to do this. Do they see it as a fabrication of the disciples, or maybe that Yeshua had let things get to his head a little bit?
That is, I think you're asking really what used to be known as the $64,000 questions, then the $1 million question, and in this case I would raise even the sum more, although I don't have such sums, but we can even raise the sum and raise the figures. All those people respect Jesus. All those people, I would say in some ways, are enamored by Jesus. You're right. Does any one of them look at Jesus as a divine figure? Partially, I didn't read the poetry. Partially because I was stopped kind of the middle of presenting Pinchas Sadeh. In his poetry, one of the most powerful poems, Jesus walks on water. This is also in Chaim Kemashal, Life as a Parable. He accepts the stories, the miracles of the New Testament. He accepts them. And there is a message there, including not only individualistic message, but also cultural message. The supernatural and the spiritual are missing in Israeli culture. Instead of that, we have this ideological society and that tells us how to think and what to embrace, and to embrace nationalism and to embrace socialism. And instead of embracing spirituality and the supernatural, which actually will afford us more freedom, more personal freedom. In some ways, you can see him as an avant-garde of a movement that became huge in Israel in the last few decades, what I would call the post-Zionist, post-ideological society that does embrace spirituality, that does embrace the supernatural, including Messianic Judaism. So you can see him in some ways as a forerunner in his interest in Christianity.
Thank you so much for your fascinating presentation. Quite often, we observe the artistic and literary community is pushing the boundaries of societal structures, and so the offensive is somewhat expected there. And I'm wondering if you could tell us something about the popular response to these proposals. What type of pushback are they getting in, say, the comments section that would help us have some sort of barometer of social acceptability?
Okay, excellent. Excellent, and I should have dwelt on that. Yosef Klausner's book is to this day available in print. Tens of thousands of Israelis have read him. For many, this is where they studied about Jesus. Many more people read Klausner than they read Flusser, unfortunately, or other luminaries of Second Temple Judaism, some of whom are sitting here among us. He was a canonical figure, not just for the Israeli right. The book, he was a canonical figure for the Israeli right, but he was also later on the editor of the Hebrew Encyclopedia. He was the teacher, I forgot to mention that, of the father of Netanyahu. Father of Netanyahu wrote his dissertation under the supervision of Joseph Klausner. But that being said, as far as his book on Jesus goes, this became a canonical book. And incidentally, the historians of the Hebrew University did not like the book, which they didn't consider to be academic and scholarly enough, and they refused to allow him to teach in the Department of History, which later on separated into Jewish history and general history. You teach your Hebrew courses on the history of modern Hebrew literature, fine. There too, there was a rebellion later on. But we will not allow you to teach history. Although Netanyahu, the father, did write an historical dissertation. That's about Klausner. Kabak's book was very well received, read again by tens of thousands of Israelis throughout the decades. Because that's in many ways, he respects Jesus, he views Jesus as a teacher, as a religious figure, but he did not overstep the boundaries in presenting him as a supernatural, as a person with supernatural abilities or superhuman abilities. In the case of Pinchas Sadeh, the establishment hated him, absolutely turned against him, but he became an iconic figure for the growing rebellious youth that began in the 60s and 70s to embrace and appropriate Western values of freedom and individuality. So, in fact, Pinchas Sadeh was the kind of author that you would find his book on almost every shelf in the 60s and 70s of educated, secular Israelis who read novels and poetry. In spite of his promotion of the supernatural, Orthodox Jews did not accept his advocacy. His advocacy was accepted as a rebellious gesture. And again, I quoted Kurzweil, but there was this famous writer and poet who just died recently in an old ripe age, Chaim Guri. In his autobiographical book, Sefer HaMeshugah, the crazy book, he goes out of his way. It was written already in the early 70s, goes out of his way to defame Pinchas Sadeh. We were fighting for a state. What was Pinchas Sadeh doing at the time? Having love affairs. Can you imagine? I mean, this is So he's a controversial figure, even within the Israeli countercultural literary circle. He was a strange, a white raven. First he advocated Christianity, and then without giving up, I mean, Christianity in the way he understood it, and Christian figures and Christian symbols. And then he, at the very end of his life, he became a returnee to tradition, but not the way that people return to tradition usually into Orthodox Judaism, just embracing layers both of Christian messages and Jewish messages, Nachman of Breslov, etc. Is still a controversial figure. He was never accepted officially as one of Israel's greatest writers, in spite of his popularity and influence in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I don't know if that starts to answer the question. And I can go on and on.
Thank you very much, Professor.